Hello, and welcome to our digital strategy chat, brought to you by Denver Data Web. As a digital strategy company, we help our clients overcome their unique challenges with a goals-focused approach to web development, web design, and digital marketing. My name is Sarah Joswiak Davis, and today we have David with us.
Hi, David, digital strategist with Denver Data Web. Thank you.
Also, I didn't say it before, I'm a digital marketing analyst with Denver Data Web. Thank you, David, and thank you for everyone joining us today. Additionally, if you have any questions, feel free to chime in the comments or the chat. Today, we are going to talk about the Drupal 9 upgrade or migration. How long does it take? What does it involve? There's a lot of questions going around with this. For some people, it may seem like it should be the touch of a button. It should be easy. But there's a lot more that goes into it. There's a lot of nuanced details with the upgrade, as well as a lot of other things to discuss. So we will jump into it. David, did you have anything to say about the Drupal 9 migration or upgrade before we get started?
Yeah, so, when we started the basics, I'm guessing most likely anybody who tunes into this or any of the videos we might make from it, they're going to know what Drupal is. But for those looky-loos and people just wondering, what Drupal is a content management system, right? So It's web software that involves programming code, databases, things like that to put together a website. And it's really a compelling system. It's used in very many of the enterprise level websites out there, whether it's universities, big corporations, but you can even use it for like a smaller website too. If you have like a blog or like a marketing website for your small business, right? It's pretty variable what you can do with it. So it's really powerful. But with great power comes great responsibility. I'm going to borrow that from Spider-Man, right? So it's a software framework. And, even if you have like Windows running on your computer, right, Sarah, or maybe you got Mac software, if you're running like a MacBook, that has to be updated. There's security updates or the software has new features over time. Websites are like that too when they use these platforms like Drupal. There's updates over time. Sometimes there's smaller ones for security stuff, but sometimes they're bigger ones because they're adding a lot new features. It's the next version. So from Windows XP to Windows 2000, Windows 7, nobody ever used that, to Windows 10 or something like that. It's like that. But you just press a button, right, when you're updating Windows, and come back an hour later, and hopefully it didn't crash and kill your computer.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, that doesn't sound too technical. I just press a button and update Windows.
Yeah, thank you, Windows. I'm glad we don't have to do anything too crazy for that. With websites.
So this is not just like any other plugin upgrade or site upgrade. You cannot just press a button. Can you tell us about that, David, and why?
So there's a variety of content management system out there. Half the internet runs on WordPress, right? And a lot of people are familiar with that. WordPress does have some capabilities built in it where you can just press the button, update the plugins, that sort of deal, or upgrade to the next version. That's cool. That's great. Drupal has been working on something like that for a little while because there's tricky things about that. Certainly, there's no guarantee when you press that button that your whole WordPress site isn't just going to blow up on you, like figuratively speaking. Like it can crash. There might be incompatibilities between the versions of those plugins and the core software for WordPress or whatever. And so you press a button doesn't mean it's going to guarantee you that it's going to be great when you're done with that. It can be similar like that with a Drupal website. You don't have the push button thing necessarily. There has been a migrate button in the past, but that's typically not recommended because oftentimes the Drupal website is using a variety of modules and things like that, which in custom code can be very sophisticated. You want to make sure that, if you're doing things right, that it's not going to just blow up after you do the upgrade process. So you're well advised to put in some effort on the front end to determine, when you do get to that next version, is everything going to work together properly? And for some people, for some websites, if your Drupal website is very basic, for lack of a better way to describe it, doesn't use a ton of modules, doesn't have a lot of customized code, that might actually be a pretty quick process. It may not be too involved, but most, organizations using Drupal like to do some customized things with it, something that's tailored to their particular business model and their needs and integrations, things like that. which, that just increases the amount of work you might need to do. So can you just press a button? Not really. And how sophisticated of a process it's going to be, how easy it's going to be, is largely going to be dependent on how complex your website is. Imagine that.
So is
And
there
kind of
any
goes from there.
place that you can reference to find out if your different modules or different parts of your site are going to migrate well, or if they're going to need some professional intervention?
Yeah, totally. There's a lot of great tools, and I imagine we're probably going to put together a little list that you can use. Some tools that we'll put on some of our blog posts, on our website, and resources like that. But you know, not to get too much into the technical side of things, but there are resources like on Drupal.org, and the API documentation, where you can look up, for a developer, specific methods and functions and things to see if those are deprecated. And that's the term, we might want to circle back even to talk a little bit about, why it proceeds that way, one big version to the next. But essentially, there's things that were part of the Drupal system that you could use before, you no longer can use them. They're old, they're being phased out. And if you're still trying to use them in your modules on your site and they're no longer available, well, that's how it goes, right? Like it won't work anymore. And there's some tools that you can use, whether they're additional modules or even little forms you can use on Drupal websites to check, hey, is this module got a Drupal 9 version? I want to get from 8 to 9. Is there a Drupal 9 version of this module? If not, that could be a problem. You may have to see if you use something different, or kind of refactor your website to not use that module anymore. There's also tools to scan your code. So if you have custom code and custom modules in your Drupal website, there are tools you can use to scan your code base to look for some of these deprecated, is where I'm using, methods and functions and features, to see if you're made use of them, and then identify like, hey, I'm going to have to update my code to use the new version of the way things are done in a new version. So yeah, there's a lot of tools for that. And that's going to help support people, but ultimately you got to do your due diligence to see what kind of footprint you have for that migration and upgrade process.
So it sounds like the average person might have some difficulty with this, correct? Is it advisable that you get a web development company or a web development team to help you through this process?
Yeah, I think this day and age, Drupal used to be much more of a hobbyist platform years ago. I think more and more the kinds of, if we talk about people using Drupal, it's more often than not, it's going to be organizations, companies. They're investing in their web presence and their platform and what they're doing with it. They probably also have some developers on their team anyway working with it, because Drupal isn't an easy system to use by any definition. It's very powerful. Get the most out of it. You got to really dive in there in a lot of cases. So, but that doesn't mean necessarily your team is well equipped to handle something as big as like a major version upgrade. It may not have done one before. They're not sure how the process goes. If you have the bandwidth and time and energy and resources to, help your team go through that process, well, that's great. There's going to be a lot of institutional learnings there, and they're going to learn a lot about Drupal at a very core level by going through that process. You're not going to learn. There's no way to learn more about Drupal than trying to upgrade from one version to the next. I promise you. It's really getting it to the heart of how all those systems interact. But let's say your team at your organization has a lot of other responsibilities, like continuing to develop your products and systems, day-to-day stuff. Taking all that time to work on the upgrade may make it difficult for them to focus on other critical aspects of the business operations. So looking at it from that standpoint, it can be highly beneficial to have, an outside team augment your team, to help with that area that they have really critical experience with already, to get that done in a much smoother fashion, to kind of get it done quicker, with less pitfalls being fallen into, and problems, help kind of navigate that path much more successfully. And there's a lot of value to that.
So say I do get a really good team on this, they're experienced, they've been through this. It sounds like even each part of the upgrade or the migration, if you will, can take either a single line of code or 20 lines of code, or even more than that. That sounds like it could take a really long time. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah,
Well,
it really depends.
how long are we expecting?
And it's neat that you mentioned migration there, because in a way that me and my teams have always approached it is it's often a migration and an upgrade built together. And that's largely because in Drupal's history, each major upgrade has been rather tremendous in size. You know, Drupal 6 to 7 was a huge change in a lot of key systems. Like, you know, the introduction of like the database API changed fundamentally how the core of like Drupal worked is big. So a lot of stuff had to be refactored and redone code-wise, custom modules and stuff. Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, also a monumental change. One of the biggest pieces of that was significant parts of the code base were now taken out and replaced with essentially like third-party code, like the Symfony framework for PHP, which had a number of benefits, but, you know, created, you know, more work might be one way to put it, but, you know, it's always about pros and cons, right? It, you know, that made it so like Drupal is now taking advantage of other people's work so that, you know, kind of core new features could be focused on by a Drupal core team, and other things that are like, you don't want to reinvent the wheel for it, that's already been taken care of. You can just borrow the code that's already done in Symfony. That's a really neat idea. Furthermore, it's really popular and there's a lot of developers out there that use it. That makes it easier for other people to come into the Drupal community and start working on Drupal and have familiarity with this big system has a big place in the PHP programming community. PHP is programming language on which Drupal is largely built upon. So that was huge. But, you know, to give kind of some very short backstory, the Drupal community and community leadership recognized that these big upgrades were really disruptive because they take a long time, take a lot of investment and resources, and not everybody was really happy about that. So there was a big organizational and strategic focus with how the Drupal project was going to be managed in the future, which was to make it more streamlined and predictable and sustainable and going through these upgrade processes. So beginning with Drupal 8 to 9 was going to follow a very set sequence of minor upgrades and releases to the major upgrade. And there would be a release schedule and you'd know what's coming. But another key thing here was to make it so that when it was time to get to Drupal 9, it wasn't going to be a huge monumental change. It was, if you had kept up with all these updates, and through each of these updates, new things were added, but also things were deprecated, just not turned off. They were just indicated as this will go away with Drupal 9, just so you know. If you kept up with those minor releases and upgrades all through that process, of course, of several years, when it came time for Drupal 9, and you were already at the last, you know, minor release for Drupal 8, which was 8.9, it effectively, you are there. From 8.9 to 9, all it does is turns off all the stuff that was deprecated. So if you kept up with those minor updates all along the way, no work to be done, which is really beautiful.
If you did that, it is the press of a button.
Yeah, effectively.
What about
did everybody do that though?
What about those who are still on 7?
7 to 8, like I said, is a big architectural change. So that's still more in the vein of the previous types of projects. Yeah.
Okay. So is it fair to say that if you're still on Drupal 7, it's going to take quite a bit longer to upgrade to Drupal 9?
It's going to take work. Okay. That's for sure. How much is really depending on how big your site is, how many modules you're using, how much custom code, how many different libraries and integrations you have. As those things increase, so will the effort required to do it properly and without having things blow up in your face down the road, right? You know, I say that colorful expression, and you know, it may not be the best, but that's kind of how it feels when you have systems you rely upon on your website. There's bugs and they just don't work. In the Drupal space, anybody been a Drupal developer for a long time, they know about with the white screen of death. You know, he's like, this is broken. I don't know why. Sucks to be me. So yes, a Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 upgrade can be an extensive project if you have a really large website, or even have multiple websites that are all part of a suite of, you know, Drupal websites working together, right? That can be pretty lengthy. I mean, if you have a website that's using Drupal and Drupal 7, that all it does is uses core content types. So what are content types? It's like, you know, a basic page or an article content. It's like a post type in WordPress. It's just a way to show content on a page, right? And you don't have any contributed modules. And all you basically did with the website was create pages like blogs. Upgrading that is not going to be hard, right? That's going to be pretty easy. Most people don't act that way with their website, though. They like, oh, this module, I could use that. This module, I could use to do that. And that just creates complexity. And not all those modules that you use in Drupal 7 have a counterpart in Drupal 8 or 9. And that's one of the areas of difficulty, is if somebody didn't, the maintainers for the modules didn't continue that work, or decide, hey, we're not going to continue this after Drupal 7 for reasons. Now you need to find an alternative. And that may require further changes to how your website works. So that's a piece of that puzzle.
So one thing that I'm aware of with Drupal, and correct me if I'm wrong, whereas you won't see this as much with WordPress, the community contributed modules or anything like that it's community reviewed. So whether or not those are going to upgrade properly, whether or not those need extra code, that's something that the community can contribute knowledge to, correct? So that you're going to have more knowledge with those up front than you would with, say, a WordPress plugin. Am I right about that?
On the WordPress side, because we, here at Different Day, we work with both platforms. We work with open source.
Yeah.
So we got this really interesting perspective, right? We pick the platform to meet our clients' needs, and those are often very different. With WordPress, if I'm going for like picking plugins and things like that, the safest thing is not to use any community plugins for WordPress if you want to have more control over your WordPress security and sustainability. But then you're doing a lot of work doing custom development. But if you got the budget and the resources for that, that's great. Sometimes you don't, so you want to draw on community plugins. You're looking at, when was the last time this WordPress plugin was updated? It's one of the first things I check, and what is its current compatibility with current WordPress core version, right? Those are like big indicators, right? This plugin hasn't been updated in 5 years. Oh no, that's not good, right? With Drupal, yes, there's community committees that vet the contributed Drupal modules for like security vulnerabilities and following best practice, right? As well, they go through kind of like a release stage status, determine like how much are they considered confidently can be put on production sites or something like that. So there might be like an alpha release, beta release, or and if you go to like the Drupal module pages on the web, they might have green as like this is production ready, right? And so these contributed modules, since they're being developed by community involvement, sometimes that community involvement is like a big company contributing their own developers to work on. Sometimes it's just individuals out there, freelancers. But either way, there are people working on it. Some modules get more attention. They're used a lot. They're getting resources. They're getting contributions. Some of them, it's just somebody else's their pet project. Sometimes they have the room to do that. Sometimes they don't. A classic example here is the web form module for Drupal. Very popular module for years. The primary maintainers for it, for Drupal 7 and prior, decided with the advent of Drupal 8, they didn't really want to continue working on it. It did not continue in its format into Drupal 8 in the same way. It was taken over by new maintainers, and they completely re-architected the module in a totally different path, right? And that's how it is sometimes. But if you're trying to retrofit how your Drupal 7 website utilized web form into Drupal 8, you got to go through an upgrade path to migrate that stuff. And that's a key thing you have from like Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 or 9 versus Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 is this idea of you needing to migrate your content, because with structural and database changes, sometimes the data model, the content model of your website, of your Drupal website, is going to be different. So rather than your content being static and the code around it changing, with a big upgrade like 7 to 9, you're essentially, one of the processes we use is we create the new home for it and the structure that it's going to be, the content model, the structural and the code-based stuff that's organizing how it's managed, and then take the content and move it into its new home, into all the places it needs to fit into, all its little cubbies, its little closets where the content resides, right? And that's why it's very often a migration into an upgrade. With Drupal 8 to 9, probably not as much of the case of that, because if you're keeping up with those updates, removing the bits and pieces that Drupal 9 is shedding that it had in Drupal 8, and doing all the core updates, it's a much smaller thing.
So that makes me wonder then, why did they end 8 in November of 2021, but Drupal 7 is still on until November of 2022? Why do it that way? Why end 8 before 7?
7 was going to end earlier, actually, and they pushed it back like a year because of COVID. That's really nice, because it's a big investment, right? And a lot of people were struggling with resources and other things because of the COVID pandemic and all that, which it's, people are just trying to deal with that as best they can. And a lot of organizations are struggling with that investment. So they did push that back, but they didn't push back the Drupal 8 one. That's coming past, right? So that already happened. So if you're still on Drupal 8, you're probably thinking right now, all right, how long is it going to take us to do this? So one of the things that came about when we talked about earlier a few minutes ago about that usage of Symfony, the PHP framework for software development, being made a part of Drupal 8 and beyond. Well, now that's a third-party framework that Drupal needs to stay in tandem with in terms of releases. Symfony has its own release schedule and updates to its software, and those need to be kept in sync with Drupal, or vice versa. Drupal needs to be kept in sync with that. Older versions of Symfony, they have security vulnerabilities that get patched out in newer versions of Symfony. And since Drupal 8 and 9 are kind of tailored for different versions of Symfony, because they're using new and different features of it, they need to be kept in sync with that. So Drupal core, like Drupal 9, requires Symfony 4.4, right? And Drupal 8 used an older version of that. Basically, the long story short is they need to end of life Drupal 8 coinciding with that release schedule of Symfony, because otherwise it'll be using insecure versions of Symfony as part of its core software, which is not advisable. So that's why it just needed to happen and couldn't be pushed back, is so that Drupal could stay in kind of lockstep with that release cycle with Symfony. And there's other things like Drupal 9 requires PHP version 7.3, and there's other minimum requirements for like databases like MySQL and all that stuff. Even some of the other tools that aren't necessarily, they're more required than they used to be, like Drush is like a Drupal tool for command line tools. All these have like newer, more up-to-date versions that are required for Drupal 9. So like Drupal 8 uses older version. You got to keep up with it. If you haven't, it creates more work.
Okay, so that gets me thinking. It almost feels like the clock is ticking now. It's January. We have until November. It sounds like those upgrades, migrations, however you want to word it, can take 2 days, but they can also take up to 10 months, which is how much time we have left. What are your thoughts? If people who have Drupal websites who need to still upgrade them, do they still have enough time?
Yeah, and here's the thing about security vulnerabilities and stuff like that. Like, from one day to the next, the day after the go live of like Drupal 9, or a day after the end of life of official support for Drupal 8, are you all of a sudden like going to get hit and attacked and totally taken out? Well, no, not realistically. Sometimes there are vulnerabilities that are discovered. Dare I say, bring up Drupal from years ago. It's very dramatic sounding, and it was a dramatic occasion. Every platform gets big software vulnerabilities from time, and you take care of them. You patch them out. You don't get those patches. It's just a matter of time before somebody gets around to your website, see if they can break into it and do something not so nice with it, right? And you're just kind of rolling the dice. Every day, every week, every month that goes by, you're just increasing your vulnerability profile now. So that doesn't sound so bad, but it gives them maybe some urgency, right? So Drupal 8 is already end of life official support. There's going to be, vendors are looking at trying to retroactively do patches for updates from like Drupal 9 and back, and that's been done for Drupal 7 and stuff like that, and or Drupal 6 before that. That is the case, but it gets trickier and trickier, and there's longer time periods between when vulnerabilities are identified and when they can be retroactively backported to older versions of non-supported Drupal anymore. So you're better off if you get off the older version of platform as soon as is reasonably possible, right? Drupal 7, since project you have kind of like the bulk of this year to do it. Drupal 8's already happened. If you're on Drupal 8 now, realistically you should be trying to get to Drupal 8.9. Like the first step is get to the last version of Drupal 8 and see if your site still works the way it needs to. Then you're pretty much ready to go to Drupal 9. You get your other dependencies, is what we refer to, the things that it needs, like the PHP on your server and other stuff, to make sure it's where it needs to be. And then you can kind of do that. You can assess to see what other work you might need to do. And then you can determine like how big of a project is going to be. If you got a lot of contributed modules, a lot of custom modules, prepare to have, maybe a couple months of, planning, architectural changes, implementing those and doing testing. So you have enough time to do that. So if that's the case, if Drupal 8 site, I would be working on it right now if you haven't already. It's just, probably should have gotten to it already, but there's still time, and you just start the process. If you're in Drupal 7 still, you kind of have the rest of the year. But here's the thing, we talk a little bit about human nature. People think, oh, we still got time. We still got time. And of course you do. But with any project, most organizations underestimate the amount of time they will need to do any kind of complex change. You're going to want to give yourself enough time so you're not feeling like you're trying to rush things. And like I said, like as soon as like the official support ends, it doesn't mean the next day everything's going to blow up. It's not like Y2K or something like that. Kids are out there like, what's Y2K? But there you go. You want to give yourself the time so you can do properly. You also don't want to rush it because that can create problems and errors. What's that whole kind of the mythical man month or whatever? It's like, let's just throw more people at it. Well, you want to have the appropriate team size allocated to it so that you can do it in a thorough manner and make sure you check off all the boxes for everything. You can do the appropriate testing. And so that way you don't have to do a lot of rework or refactoring later on because you tried to rush through it and you just made the problem bigger. So I would say definitely if you have a Drupal 7 website, you should be, if you haven't already, you should be starting that process now, even if it's just the discussion phase of planning, So give yourself, if you've, let's say like an enterprise scale website, yes, you probably should have started by now, but there's still time. If you have, you think, oh, I don't think our website's too, 50 to 100 contributor modules, that's a lot, right? You should be starting that process now because you need to see which modules can you use. Give yourself plenty of time.
Very cool. And at Denver Data Web, this is a service that we specialize in, but as the time draws nearer, we may not have, we're a smaller team. We may not be able to take it on last minute. So that's very good to know. Start now, give yourself plenty of time, give your team plenty of time to.
Oh yeah, especially, if you're thinking you're probably going to need to work with another, consulting vendor or team, like ours, for example, to augment what your team is doing, right? There could be a lot of that going on. There's other people doing the same thing. And so you'll find that companies of our sort that do this kind of work, there's going to be projects being added on, and there's only so much any company could do. So you'll be looking around like, can these people help me? Can these people? We always call back and let people know, and we go through the process like, hey, here's where we can fit you in on this cycle. Some companies will call you back. Like they're so busy, right? That would be a horrible experience. So yeah, definitely give yourself time to be able to approach the problem in a very conscientious way so you can fit it into your organizational goals. And so you may have things that are unrelated to the website, platform that are important to your company from a marketing standpoint, a product launch thing or something like that. Or maybe if you're at a higher education, you work in like semesters and terms and you try and schedule major launches of website changes stuff in between those periods of downtime and stuff, right? So the more time you give yourself cushion to plan ahead, you give more opportunities to schedule that where you want. And that's pretty advantageous too.
And because everybody who's still on Drupal 8 or Drupal 7 is going through this at the same time. So it's, crunch time. But
yeah, a little bit. Yeah, again, it's really hard to say. Like everybody, I'm sure just about everybody, we're thinking like, how long does it take for Drupal 9 migration? Right? It depends. It's like, it really does depend. So, starting that process to think about it yourself or work with somebody so they can inspect your code base, look at the module you're using, that, then you can start making some informed and educated guesses really about like how much it probably take. And the more time you can devote to that, the more precise those estimates are going to be. Could take a week, could take, 6 to 9 months.
Yeah. So the name of the chat is how long does the Drupal upgrade take? And that's our answer. Could take a week, could take up to 9 or 10 months. So plan ahead.
It's also how big is your team and how experienced are there too, right? There's so many factors. So if you have a team of rock stars and they've done upgrades before and you're already at Drupal 8.9, just get to 9, they'll probably bang it out pretty quick. They're like, yep, it's done, boss, it's good to go. If they never done an upgrade migration for and it's a huge website, it could be a lengthy process and they're probably going to need some help.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've covered a lot today. Looks like we're at the end of our time. Look for our digital strategy chats, not every week anymore, but probably we took a break during the holidays, but probably about once a month moving forward at this time on Fridays. Be sure to check out our website at denverdata.com, our YouTube channel, which you can either search on YouTube or you can find at denverdata.com/YouTube. Be sure to like and subscribe and have a great weekend.